Well, Kashtira Ariseheart is banned. And, well, unfortunately for me, I finally get to do a Death by Design episode on this. And, well, as I'll just say for this, I was actually planning to do the episode before it was actually banned. I didn't necessarily sniff it out, but I could just feel that the writing was on the wall. However, I guess Konami graced me with the luck of being able to do the video on this anyways. So, without further ado, as always for the Death by Design, we have to go back in time. It is February 6th, 2023, and in 4 days, February 10th, Photon Hypernova will be released into the TCG. Now, for those who obviously are listening, if you've been playing for the last year, this actually sounds very new to you. And the reason I want to start on February 6th instead of February 10th, which is the release date of Photon Hypernova, February 6th holds a special place, as this is the announcement of the ban list that we would be receiving. As within a week's time, we were finally going to see the end of the most powerful deck that we'd been facing in the modern day, being Tira Elemental Shizu, as February 13th would mark the first ban list with most of the cards hit from Tier Elements and the Shizu cards on it, which would mark the end of this tyrannical time. However, one of the things that was more alarming was that the next best deck that was permitted to the game, being Kashtira, was about to hit the metagame hard, and without a serious meta check from the aforementioned Tier Elements, we were going to see essentially Kashtira take over its spot. As once post February 10th took place, Kashtira mounted itself as the best deck of the format, and would do so for the next, essentially, almost year. As Kashtira alone had already proved to be a somewhat viable deck in the Darkwing Blast set, however, it was missing something. As most people would watch before, Kashtira by itself wasn't really doing much, as its slow-pacing game didn't allow it to really do anything, and was basically forced to play this really grinding control game, where the deck would slowly out-aggress the opponent, as although they did not have too much offense, having something like Fenrir, Unicorn, and being able to bring out a Shangri-Ira allowed zone locking to be a somewhat competent strategy at this point. But once the release of Photon Hypernova, this all changed, with the fast-powered Kashtira Ariseheart allowing you now to accelerate into Xyz plays, and with the new Kashtira Ariseheart, which would effectively warp the format for the next 6 months, we were going to see the meta change, and the meta changed fast with its appearance, as some of the decks that were still viable at the time would be able to struggle along, and unfortunately, this wasn't going to do much in the face of Kashtira, especially with Ariseheart. Although the deck didn't seem too dominant after receiving its support, as many people realized there was ways to play around this, it spun two really oppressive boards, one in the form of the massive zone lock, as most people will know what that means or have seen pictures of it, so I don't really need to discuss it. This wasn't necessarily the best way to play the deck, as zone locking the opponent was really good. It was too greedy, as if the opponent was playing something like Nibiru the Primal Being, you were going to get punished as soon as they knew it was time to nib you. And in the case of others, the aforementioned strategy that would become what we would know Kashtira until actually the day of my recording, this was going to be basically Kashtira Control or Ariseheart Control, which focused on protecting your Ariseheart and letting the big macro cosmos do his job. Now, I've kind of skipped talking about Ariseheart up until this point just because everybody kind of knows what it does, and the history of Kashtira is kind of why I think we have to talk about Ariseheart. But finally, we get to go into the stats of this very powerful monster. Starting with the effects, we will use this. Once per turn, you can also Xyz summon Kashtira Ariseheart by using one Kashtira monster you control, if an effect of Kashtira Shangri-Ira was successfully activated this turn, and vice versa, you transfer its materials to this card. That is the alternate summoning condition. Let's talk about the effect. Any card sent to the graveyard is banished instead. Once per chain, each time a card or cards is banished, attach one banished card to this card as material. Once per turn, quick effect, you can detach 3 materials from this card, then you target one card on the field, banish it face down. Now, if you're reading this correctly from what I'm saying and hearing this correctly from what I am saying, this card is insanely strong. Although, if it was to be summoned through its normal summoning conditions, I do think that limits this card, being just 3 level 7 monsters. The ability for it to essentially use its own archetype to turbo itself out is really crazy, and essentially by utilizing its ability to banish cards as a macrocosmos, effectively allowing to fuel itself by this once per chain effect, this was actually insane. As if you start to realize what I mean by this, effectively as any card would go to the graveyard, it would be banished. And since Ariseheart works the way it does, those cards, once they hit the graveyard, would be able to be attached to it. So for the opponent playing against an Ariseheart, this was really detrimental, as once one of their cards would hit the graveyard, basically as a spell, that spell, if it was just used to be utilized for whatever it was, would immediately be banished, and then the Ariseheart would attach it to itself as material. And if you get what I mean, this means that Ariseheart will almost always have 3 material through its own effect and or by adding other cards to it. This just makes it stronger. Now, effectively, with its once per turn effect allowing you to attach 3 to banish 1 card face down, this made Ariseheart very problematic, as now Ariseheart was able to basically just target down cards and banish them face down, as all it has to do is target a card, not anything specific, and hit it. And now Ariseheart by itself, just by reading these effects, already proves why it's so strong. It was already a really powerful monster, and also I didn't get to mention its stats, but it's sitting 3k both ways in attack and defense. So nothing's really running over Ariseheart anytime soon, and with ease. Ariseheart by itself is an amazing card that would cap off this archetype, as if you were to take it away from Kashtira, and as we're about to see, this card basically changes the game. Now, no other deck was really able to utilize Ariseheart, and some people would say, oh, well, they could tech in Ariseheart if they stole, NXC's monster through, like talents or change of heart. Yeah, that counts, but that doesn't really count. Unless you had to hard make this thing, we never really got to see Ariseheart play in other decks, as it was only really, viable in Kashtira at this time. However, we're never really going to be able to see what it would have done if Kashtira itself as a deck was hit a lot, because he's the one who's suffering. The reason I really wanted to jump on this for a Death by Design episode is that this one takes more of a different approach than other cards I'm going to talk about, as there are some cards that I think do suffer from the design problem that Konami gives them. However, Ariseheart suffers from something that I can't understand, and that's no balance whatsoever. As if you really look at Kashtira Ariseheart, one of the things I can't understand with this card is that it having an alternate summoning condition. In its own home deck of Kashtira, I do think that this would have been fine without it. I was going to originally do a video on how to fix it, cards with erratas, but I think Ariseheart doesn't need to have its own video, because this is something I want to talk about, and if other people see it, I'd rather them talk about it too, because I'd love to see the comments on it. But the point I want to get across is, with Ariseheart, you really look at it, it doesn't have any balance. And I had to reiterate that twice, because it's really shocking, because Ariseheart really needs some way to balance out, because it having an alternate condition, it being able to proc its own effects with its own, effect itself, is actually way too strong, and I'm not really sure why, Konami didn't maybe see this as a problem, as the first thing that pops into my mind when I see its combination effects is that if any card is sent to the graveyard and it gets banished instead, that's strong. However, it's once per chain effect, allowing it to attach any card to itself effectively really slow over time, is really confusing when it should have been just a once per turn effect, as I think that balances out that, but it doesn't have it as a once per chain. That's kind of crazy. It also has, the effect that it can attach any banished card as a material, as we would see something like when people use Prosperity, they would attach, Infinite Track Goliath, which, you're not really supposed to be able to do that, through that mechanic, but you can through Ariseheart, where you slap it underneath it and it has an additional effect for Xyz monsters, which is nuts, right? And also, it having a once per turn quick effect bounce, they did try to deal with that by limiting Ariseheart, which, they finally realized that by having 2 of these things on the field, it was just a massacre for the opponent, because essentially both of them would just painfully draw you out with two, targeting but banishing face downs. It's like, that's really annoying. The whole point is Kashtira Ariseheart by itself just sprays all over the place that this card was designed well, but this card was not thought through well, at least in my opinion. If anyone were to tell me this card was thought through very well, I don't know what to tell them. It's Macrocosmos on legs, and it basically refuels itself. In theory, an Ariseheart by itself can level enough of the opponents and yourself. I didn't even get to talk about that. You can fuel it yourself. That's another thing I didn't get to talk about. Your opponent doesn't just have to deal with Macrocosmos. They have to worry about fueling this thing while you're also fueling it by sending, cards that you activate to the grave to get banished. Ariseheart pretty much just keeps on powering itself up slowly. So the fact that it doesn't have more text on it to limit it is really confusing, because Ariseheart by itself is just extremely powerful. A lot of people will talk and complain about it just being annoying because of the Macrocosmos. I'm more annoyed at the fact that this card just doesn't have enough checks and balances, because there's a lot of other cards that were designed in the last couple of years that really didn't need some of their restriction clauses, or they have restriction clauses. So you'd say, oh, well, they balanced it. So how come Ariseheart didn't get it? That's literally my question. That's kind of the reason I'm not doing this in theme to the other episodes, because I would love to do it in theme to the other episodes, but I just can't, because this is something I've been wanting to talk about for a while, and this has really been bugging me, because Kashtira Ariseheart just screams, one, power creep, but more importantly, intentional power creep, which is something that, it's kind of debated in the community as a whole. But I do think when you read Ariseheart, it screams that this was meant to be power creep, that this was meant to creep against archetypes because of the massive graveyard format we basically had. And they, in some odd way, I almost feel like Konami said, well, we don't have enough counters in Dimension Shifter against Tier, so let's make a walking one for a specific archetype and make it kind of generic so that some decks could use it. I mean, it being a rank 7 really is okay, it's cool. But I'm besides the off Dark Magician player who would have been able to summon this thing, and the Red Eyes players that do exist in the shadows that would be able to summon this thing with 3 of their level 7s, and they didn't want to make Red Flare Metal. You kind of get my point with what I'm going with this. It sounds kind of goofy, but yeah. Ariseheart was a pseudo-generic monster made so that one archetype could use it, and it just oppressed everything up until this point. So I will try to finish this in the fashion of these episodes, because we finally arrived to today, which is September 15th of 2023, as we received our ban list. As effective September 25th, we will see Kashtira Ariseheart forbidden, and the reign of its terror is finally over. In this outro, I will say one thing. Kashtira Ariseheart was a card that, well, throughout this whole video, I kind of discussed of why it lacks balance. However, I do think Konami probably wanted to do this as they wanted to give one of their new archetypes something really powerful. However, this actually could have kept in line into the format had they made this a little bit more balanced and a little bit more conditional. Now, I've said enough for today. So this is Brad from the Ad Army signing off. And for all of you out there, to sign on.